All right, let's continue with the British reforms after 1763. This whole story kind of has this notion that the English were sitting in these, dark corridors of power, the smoke-filled rooms, saying, "Mwah, how do we, in a few short years, go from our biggest victory, perhaps in our history, to being in a fight with our colonies, the 13 mainland colonies, just 12 years after our great victory in the French and Indian War?" Wasn't thought of that way at the time. The English were putting in place policies that they thought made just a lot of sense. They backfired. The first we saw with Pontiac and his allies in the West were reacting to English changes that were very unpopular. And for several years, the English had to shift soldiers from places like Canada and areas of Havana. Imagine these sunburned troops that were suffering maybe from malaria or yellow fever who had fought the Spanish in Havana. They all of a sudden get shifted not back to England, but they get shifted over to fighting in the American West because it took several years to retake the forts that were lost to Pontiac and Pontiac's allies. There were 2,000 or so soldiers and settlers killed and an untold number of indigenous people in the West. Pontiac's rebellion didn't really cause the British reform, but I think it reinforced the idea that we need to do something. And what the English chose to do, and this came from the king himself, because we call this the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And you can see that reference here in the notes. The Royal Proclamation, basically, this is already in the works by George III and his new post-wartime advisors. They said, what we're going to do now is close the frontier along the mountains. We're not going to allow any settlers to either go out there and live. There's going to be no surveying of land. There's going to be no speculation, meaning buying land cheap and selling it in the West. A lot of colonists were upset about that because they thought they had participated in a war with England. They had won the war. The West should be open. The West is the future. A lot of them had sacrificed. George Washington, of course, was very disappointed in all of this. And they were having the English immediately a very difficult time enforcing this. So let's take a look at what the Proclamation of 1763, also known as the Royal Proclamation, looked like. You can see it here. What the British were going to do is draw this line along the Appalachian Mountains and tell the settlers you couldn't move west of that line. And it's marked on the map. If you moved out there, the British were going to station about 10,000 soldiers in North America. 10,000, 100,000, I don't care how many. It was going to be very difficult to patrol that border. And of course, the soldiers had to do the awkward thing about, politely telling folks, I'm sorry, you live here and you have to move on the other side. And the border leaked like a sieve. There were wagons all loaded up in places like central North Carolina and Salisbury, and all these folks were going over the mountains, passing the Cherokee lands that were in western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee, the border of Pennsylvania, of course. I mean, they tried to enforce it and it didn't really work. But to the British, this made perfect sense. When the English colonists, who were often to blame for instigating attacks against Indians, and the Indians, not surprisingly, would retaliate in turn, in kind, to protect their own future, to protect their own land. They had reasons for siding with the French. Many had sided with the English. But what they certainly wanted was to keep these land-hungry colonists out of their land in the old Ohio country and in places in the American South as well. So this policy was unpopular, but it was going to be the first in these new reforms. The next part of the English reforms were going to be to try to offset some of the costs of keeping the colonists safe. And I stress in the notes that the English wanted to pay for part of the expense of keeping the soldiers on the frontier. And so London asked the colonists, who London cannot tax the English people anymore, it's almost impossible because they had riots the last time they tried to raise revenue in England itself. So the new advisor to the king, the new prime minister, after William Pitt leaves, he's a good wartime leader, but in peace not as successful, is a man named George Grenville. And Grenville's policies, there's going to be a very rapid turnover of English advisors to the king because it's often frustrating the response that they get in North America, the American colonists, to these new changes. So what Grenville said is, let's go back to some of the old laws. And one of the conclusions we got from soldiers who were fighting in North America was that the American colonists live really well and that they're really, really undertaxed. So Grenville's conclusion, as he got ideas from people who were serving in America, officers and soldiers and other representatives, and he said, yeah, why don't I just go back to the old navigation acts of 100 years before and enforce them? So Parliament passes, again, it's voted on by the people's representative in England, what's called the Sugar Act of 1754. The Sugar Act cuts in half. I know that it's strange to talk about a tax that's lowered and people protesting it, but we'll get to understand the implications of it as we go along. The Sugar Act cuts in half the tax on foreign molasses. And we know the Americans were getting a lot of molasses imported from the French sugar islands because they turned molasses into rum. But they never really paid the tax on it because it was cheaper to smuggle the stuff in and bribe the customs officials. So Grenville says we're going to lower the tax, and here's his rationale. When the tax is high, you don't get any money. If the tax is lower, we're going to collect it because we're going to enforce it. So they're going to collect it in the port cities. They're going to have closer inspection of the ships, and they're going to arrest and put people on trial who try to smuggle the items in without paying the tax on it. So it's a real slap in the face to the colonists. They're like, oh my gosh, I guess this salutary neglect from William and Mary, happy colonists or productive colonists, is over. And Grenville would respond, you bet it's over, because we need you, the colonists, and we had spent a lot of money and increased the English national debt pretty dramatically to keep the colonists safe and to expel the French from North America. And you're going to pay for part of the bill. So there will be enforcement, new revenue agents. It used to be that you can be a revenue agent and never go to the American colonies. And Grenville says with this new law, oh, you're going over there now. And of course, there was a rash of resignations. These folks were saying like, oh my God, I'll go over there and it'll be terrible living in the back country where, nobody wears clothes and everyone goes around and, eats without utensils. So all these folks in England thought it was a horrible prospect to go to North America to be a customs agent. So he had to find new folks to enforce the law. The colonial protests over the Sugar Act were in economic terms. I'll explain that in some detail. The representatives of 8 different colonies, so the assemblies, the governments of the different colonies, they sent protests to London and they said, look, not a really good time for us to have this new tax, even though the tax was cut in half. But the tax cut in half was going to be enforced. All of William Pitt's money that was pouring into the colonies during the war, well, that money was shut off. It's like turning a faucet off and the water just stops coming out. You're like, uh-oh, what happens now? So we have in the colonies kind of a post-war recession. Unemployment, wages are cut. And the colonists making an argument, not so much on this is unfair, we can't, we tax, make the decisions about that, but it was more in economic terms. And they were also kind of hinting at the idea that they would probably have to make some difficult decisions based on whether or not this Sugar Act went through. We might even have to make choices about, not purchasing as much British consumer goods. It's something that we can understand when we want to tighten the belts and try to save some money. Those economic protests, and that's where the protests around the Sugar Act were all about. They were put together and they were kind of formed in economic terms of the impact that would have. These were largely ignored by Parliament, and Grenville and Company and Parliament went forward with a new revenue measure in 1765. And this is the dreaded Stamp Act. We'll get into detail why it was so disliked by the colonists. This is a revenue measure which was going to reach directly into the colonies. The Stamp Act required the use of stamped paper on official documents. And when the paper was stamped, it was official, but it had to pay a tax to be stamped. And so this kind of reached into a whole nother level of American society. What happened was that newspapers were taxed, playing cards, dice, marriage certificates, deeds, any legal document, in other words. So in your life, you're going to have legal documents that you deal with. And sure enough, this was announced in the early part of 1765. And the Stamp Act would affect a lot more colonists. You might not be impacted by the Sugar Act, but the Stamp Act certainly was important. So in the spring, the news reaches the colonies that this is going to happen. It's going to become a reality. And the reaction of the colonists takes different forms. The first thing that happens is that Virginia, the Virginia House of Burgesses, with Patrick Henry, is a new member of the Burgesses. He waits until the Burgesses have mostly gone home for the afternoon. Maybe it was a weekend. And he's got a few ambitious folks there like himself. And he says, look, I can maybe get the people who dislike the Stamp Act the most here to agree with me, and passes a series of resolves that say that, and here's the quote from the notes, the General Assembly of this colony, Virginia, have the only and sole exclusive right and power to lay taxes. So what does that quote mean? Basically, it's translated to only Virginians can tax Virginians. And so Parliament had crossed the line by the Stamp Act of bringing about this internal tax. And so these resolves weren't really passed officially, but they were reprinted. And other colonies were reading this and saying, yay, now this is a great idea. We support what Virginia is doing. And the form of protest takes different shapes depending on what colony you're talking about. Some colonies form organizations that say we're going to not buy British goods. We would call that today a boycott or non-importation. New York calls a Stamp Act Congress. 9 colonies show up and they draw up these complaints to send formally to Parliament. So that's a pretty big deal that you get 9 colonies representatives in one room. There are chapters in Massachusetts like the Loyal Nine. Sometimes it's kind of a precursor to the so-called Sons of Liberty. Here's Patrick Henry in his address that he gave to the Burgesses. Sam Adams is one of the leaders of the Loyal Nine, which will become the Sons of Liberty. There'll also be born Daughters of Liberty chapters, which will engage in methods that they're going to try to, again, bring about, you might say, a non-importation or not consuming British goods. Some of these protests in Massachusetts specifically get violent. You get a lot of people in the colonies who are stamp agents who resign. They're like, I don't want this job because, I don't want to die, or get tarred and feathered, or other methods of intimidation. One of the persons targeted in Massachusetts is the stamp agent, and his business that he runs on the side is attacked. The lieutenant governor, his home in Massachusetts, is gutted. So the Stamp Act protests, they, hang a rope from a tree. They took like a scarecrow version of a fake stamp agent, and they hang that person, and they cut the effigy down, and they all jump on it saying, yay, we're stamping on the Stamp Act, yay. But the reality happens that there's a strong response in England, like, okay, what's going on with the intimidation of stamp agents? And to get kind of a pulse of what's happening, they call in Ben Franklin, who at the time was serving as Postmaster General. And he says, I don't know what's going on either. I'm kind of surprised. But I do know that, the pride of Americans right now is to wear English fashions. And some of them are like, yeah, but what happens if there's non-importation agreements or boycotts go into effect? And his response is they'll wear their old clothes until they can make new ones. And that kind of sets off alarm bells of members of Parliament. They're like, oh my God, if these boycotts, non-importation agreements over the Stamp Act go through, the people I represent in England are going to be very unhappy. They're going to have to lay off workers. We're going to have an economic downturn in England. And so not long after this testimony of Franklin in front of the Parliament in England, the Parliament decides we're going to repeal the Stamp Act. It doesn't matter anyway. There's no one in the colonies to enforce the Stamp Act. Through various methods, it was a dead letter by the fall. But also, as kind of a face-saving measure, Parliament says we're going to also pass the Declaratory Act. So they repeal the Stamp Act. They also pass the Declaratory Act in 1766, which says that Parliament, in all cases whatsoever, can pass taxes. So you, the colonists, might want to split hairs and say, oh, yeah, we don't like the Sugar Act, but it's over trade, so we'll just have to deal with it. But the Stamp Act is an internal tax, and that is raised in our own colonial assemblies. Parliament's like, we don't recognize that idea. We don't acknowledge that. You haven't won, colonists. In any case whatsoever, we can pass these laws. And it just reminds us that there are these big gray areas where the colonies were allowed to establish some of their own authority, but things were left unsaid. And this is going to be the story and theme of the Imperial Crisis. It also presents an immediate problem for England. How do we raise revenue? Because the Stamp Act is not a reality. That's going to get back to the king and his advisors.